unattended. Unattended luggage will be removed and destroyed. Attention, ladies and gentlemen. This is an announcement from planet X31. Please take your seats.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Columbia, this is Houston, ALS, over.
The exercise to test the reactions of troops to atom bombs used in support of an attack.
1-0-0-5-7-2.
With different degrees here.
Lower right!
Greetings, planet Earth, and welcome to the Science and Cocktails. Science and Cocktails is an initiative taken in cooperation with the Niels Bohr Institute, and its purpose is to bring first-class scientific information directly to you, Earthlings, without interference of any other sort, type of intermediate medium. Its aim is to make the flow of thoughts and the flow of sensorial perception as smooth as the flow of a cocktail mixer. Tonight's lecture will be given by Bruce Hood, Canadian-born psychologist who has flown to Denmark for the first time. He is the director of the British Cognitive Development Centre, based at the University of Bristol, and he has been awarded the Sloan Fellowship in Neuroscience. His lecture tonight will be about yourself, and how wrong you are when you think that there is an entity inside your body that goes by the name that your mother called you when you were born. He will argue that the self is just an illusion, and in fact is composed by a constellation of mechanisms and experiences.
Ladies and gentlemen, the words of Bruce Hood, they will be followed by a 3D music performance of the multimedia artist Soren Linksu, also known as Vectron.
Transmission.
Let us give a big applause to Bruce Hood. Let's give a big applause to Bruce Hood.
Hello? Have you got me? Can you hear me? Do we have audio? Can you hear me now? Okay, great. Wow. What a place. You know, when I got the invitation from Jay to come over and I saw the title of Science and Cocktails and I saw the website, I don't know if you've seen it yet, I got the impression of just being on one of these corporate gigs, you know, maybe a pharmaceutical company. Now, clearly, Christiania is it's not exactly a drug company, but so I'm delighted. I've been here a day or two, and I had a sauna yesterday, and that was an experience in more ways than one. Oh, here I am. Here's the self-illusion. Okay, so this talk is based on a book that came out last year. I'm going to start with a caveat. In England, we have a condiment called Marmite. You may not know what it is. Yeah? We got some Marmite lovers? Great, hey, hands up. Now, Marmite is illegal in Denmark, bizarrely. It violates some sort of food law, I don't know. But the thing about Marmite is that you either love it or you hate it, okay? It basically divides people. I understand there's something similar in this country I discovered, which is this salty licorice. And what I wanted to talk about is the fact that this talk I'm going to be talking about the self-illusion will divide you. Some people will either just think it's really a good idea or it makes a lot of sense, and others will really hate the idea. So it tends to polarize the audiences and the people who've read it. And I think it's because it attacks the fundamental of what it is that we all experience, which is our daily common phenomenology of us being coherent individuals with free will inside our bodies, controlling our bodies. You know, we look in the mirror each day and we can see the physical transitions, but we still feel that we're still an individual inside our body. And I'm going to suggest or propose that that is something that the brain constructs. And it's constructed over a lifetime, and I think is a really important role of childhood I'll be putting forward. But I'm also going to be showing some tricks, because the subtitle was, is it the greatest trick your brain plays? So, and because of the nature of Christiania, I'm going to be playing with your minds. So we're going to have some audience participation just for a bit of fun. So let me begin. I think this is really the best, in my opinion, exposition of the self-illusion. I mean, it's just such... oh, we haven't got any sound? Can we play that again? Yeah. Okay. You got to have the music. I mean, with the leather and the shades, it couldn't go wrong. But, you know, as much as a great science fiction film and a lot of action, it actually makes a very profound point. And for those of you who haven't seen it, and I can't believe, leave the room now and go and watch it immediately. This, if you remember, is about this character, Neo, who's living this life. He thinks he's a programmer leading a mundane life in the 20th century. When, in fact, as we well know and we discover throughout the film, this is an illusion. He's actually, like the rest of mankind, enslaved by the evil computers who are harvesting all the biochemical energy from the humans. And the way they do this, of course, is they're feeding directly into the brain a virtual reality program, a simulation, the Matrix. Now, of course, it's science fiction, but, I mean, the idea is plausible that if you could ever really control, you know, whoops. I can shout it out. I mean, I can speak louder. You can still hear me at the back, yeah? Even louder? Okay, we will need mic then. We got, all right, I can do it with that. Thank you. Thank you very much. Hello. Hello, 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 hello. Hello, hello, testing. Yeah, we got it? Okay. God, this feels like a rock concert. Whoa, yeah. Okay, where was I? Oh, yeah, so I was talking about, in principle, if you could control the input to the brain, then in a sense you never would know that you were in prison, because clearly, if you take the materialist stance, which I do, our phenomenology, our experience, is really the output of the brain. We are simulating the external world continuously. We're feeding information, taking all the information in from our senses, interpreting it based on all the experiences that we've had in the past, and this produces this model, this simulation of the external world. We don't have any direct contact with reality. So I'm going to show you some examples now. This is one where I'm just going to cut out. Okay. Okay. Because we feel that consciously we're always aware of things all the time. But the truth of the matter is that unless you're actually paying attention to your world, whoops, go away. Why can't I see anything? Oh, we're having gremlins tonight. Oh, here we go. There we go. Change blindness. So the point is about this next demonstration. I mean, most of us feel that we're fully aware all the time, and that consciousness is this continuous stream, and we've got all this rich, vivid experience to note. But the point is that that's a bit of an illusion. Consciousness isn't this kind of veridical, rich experience. And this is a demonstration. What you're going to do in this scene is it's changing with a blanking frame. And what you may find, it's very difficult to notice anything actually changing from one scene to the next. But I assure you that this scene is changing very dramatically right in front of your very eyes. But you may notice something but not sure initially what it is. But if I remove the blanking frames, you'll see actually these changes are quite significant. And so the point is, this is simulating what happens every time you're basically blinking. And if you're not paying attention to the world, then radical changes could be happening right in front of your very eyes. So the phenomenological experience that we're having is, to some extent, illusory as well. That's hung up. When you put the blank in, you can't see the changes. Now, let me just get rid of that. Get back to where we were. In fact, you're actually, we have this notion that the visual world is rich, but in fact, you're only aware of a portion of the field that's about the size of your thumb, because that's actually the only area you're processing with any high density or any degree of fidelity. At the edge, your vision is very blurred. In fact, it's colorless. You've got two black holes, basically where you can't see anything in your visual field, but your brain literally fills it in. And every time you move your eyes, the world is literally cutting off. You're effectively blind for about 2 to 3 hours of every waking day. But you wouldn't know that because your brain creates such a wonderful simulation and a model of the world. It just creates this. And I think one of the best simulations it creates is the simulation of the self. I think that we are a product or an output of this remarkable thing. Okay. Now, I need to make something clear. When I say something's an illusion, I'm not denying the phenomenological experience. There's certainly an experience of the self. An illusion doesn't mean that there's nothing there. And what an illusion means is it's not what it seems. And I like to demonstrate this with this really simple illusion. It's called the Knizia. And of course, most of you should be seeing this sort of square in front of the 4 black circles. But there is no square there at all. Now, what's really, and this is the really cool bit, if I was to go into your visual cortex, if I ever got the ethical approval, with an electrode, okay, to find your visual processing neurons in the back, there is a subset of cells which fire to real edges, but they also fire to the illusory edges created by the Knizia. In other words, what the brain's doing is it's seeing this pattern, it's coming up with an interpretation, namely that there's a white square, And then it's back propagating to these lower processing areas, saying there should be a line there so far as if there really is one there. So the brain is really hallucinating that experience. So that's kind of cool. Okay, let's get rid of that. Whoops. Okay, so the next demonstration. This is going to be the McGurk effect. If you haven't seen it, it's pretty cool. But I want you to watch the man and see if you can tell what he's saying. And we will need sound for this, so let's make sure. Let's pray it works. Let's get rid of this.
Ba 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 ba.
Okay, so hands up if you heard da 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 da. Okay, and you put money on that, wouldn't you? Yeah. It could make some money here. Okay, I'm going to play the same tape again, but this time close your eyes.
Ba 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 ba.
How many hear Baba? Yeah, he is actually saying Baba. But you perceive Dada. Now, why is that? Well, because what we've done is we've interchanged the actual soundtrack of Ba, and we filmed him mouthing Ga, and you don't have any representation in your brain for that shape and that sound, so your brain creates the illusion of Ba. So you don't have any direct contact with reality. No. You're really formulating it. Your brain is creating it all the time. Now, that basic point, I think, is worth remembering. Okay. Oh, here's another one. Here's another one about illusions, showing that actually it's just not all in the mind. I love this. This is a simple one. This is a simple kind of brightness illusion. So this looks brighter than there, okay? Oh, sorry. Okay. This on the edge here should look brighter. Yeah, everyone sees that. Of course, you're not surprised to discover that they're exactly the same luminance. But here's a really important point. If I measure your pupil dilation, what happens is that when you're looking at this one, that's me, when you're looking at this one over here, your pupils constrict. Now, constricting pupils is basically to protect the eye from too much illumination, too much light, to protect the retina. So the point about this demonstration is that even though it's just an illusion, okay, the brain sends signals down to the muscles which control the pupil dilation and change the pupil size. So it might be all in the mind, but it's changing the body. Okay, so illusions aren't trivial. Okay, there we go. All right, where are we going next? All right, so this is the center of the talk. I, me, self. This is me. Actually, this is my brain. I had it imaged for one of our studies. And it's a very sobering experience to see yourself as a physical system. But I've come to the conclusion that I am a physical system, a complex system, but I'm still a meat machine. And this is really what I am. Everything that I am, in terms of all my anxieties, my emotions, my humor, my memories, my fear of audiences, all these sorts of things must be the product of our brain. Because if you damage the brain, or you alter the brain, or you change the functions of the brain, then my mind is changed. So I'm a materialist, and unashamedly. Until I hear otherwise, that's the perspective that I take. But how did I become Bruce? I didn't pop out of my mother's womb and say, "Hi, I'm Bruce." You know, I had to become me. I think that me or the self is really a combination of the phenomenology of consciousness that we're all having at this moment, but also the identity, the me, who I am. And that identity is built up over the experiences that we have throughout our lives. So there's an I, the phenomenology of the here and now, and there's a me, which is the historical content, the autobiography of who we are. And these come together. So I think the babies probably do have a kind of I. I think they have all the conscious awareness that we do. But they may not have the ways of interpreting it, and I don't think, well, they can't obviously have any historical biography that makes them up who they are. And so over the process of development, I think this is how we become elaborated. And I think the self is really just this characterization created by the brain, an individual. Okay. So let's just say a little bit about brains. As you're probably aware, the brain is made up of many structures, but the ones which are relevant for this discussion are the neurons, which are all in the cortex. There's a lot of them. There's 86 billion of them. And they have lots of connections, 10,000 each. So there's almost virtually an unlimited number of the potential patterns that the brain can form. Now, here's the interesting thing you probably didn't know, is that babies are born with a full complement of neurons. Okay, they have about 86 billion, just like an adult. But what they don't have is all the connections. And that's what's really changing in the early brain development. It's the wiring up of the brain. And so the brain is really wiring up in relation to two processes. One, there's a kind of biological process to sort of send information out and connect up. But there's also the role of the environment and experience in shaping those connections. So for example, if you look at the cortex, this outer layer of the brain, developmentally, this is a newborn and this is a 6-year-old over here. These are the neurons, and you can see the connections. These are the axons and the dendrites. But as you look at the age and development, the number of cells doesn't change, but the number of connections do. So there's an explosion of connectivity, and this connectivity is supported by the environment. Because if you don't get experiences, then the connections atrophy, they wither away. So we say in neuroscience it's a use it or lose it principle. Now this has implications. It explains, for example, how we can tune into the environment so that we can hear differences in languages. So here's again an audience participation. I'm going to play you two sounds from different languages, and I want you to tell me whether they're the same or different. Okay.
Duck. Duck.
Okay, let's do that one again. Oh dear. Sorry, not chickens. I'm not doing the chicken talk. That's a different talk entirely. Okay, let's try that again. Can we get some more sound on that one?
Duck. Duck.
Same or different? Hands up for same. Hands up for different. Oh wait, so some of you are not sure, but those that you think it's mostly the same, well they are in fact the same. Let's just prove. Oh, they're different, sorry. Other way around. All right, here's Zulu again.
Bill, Bill.
Hands up for same. Hands up for different. Very good, you're all native Zulu speakers, they are in fact different. Let's try Hindi again.
Dul, dul.
Hands up for same. Hands up for different. They are different. They're all different. And the point is that you can't necessarily hear them. I mean, you can hear a bit in Zulu. But if you're not exposed to some aspects of the environment, then it becomes very difficult to represent them, to process them, because you don't have any experience in your brain stored. Now, that's not just for languages. It works also for faces. Oh, gosh. We're really having problems here. Oh, there we go. Nope, 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 nope. There we go. So, for example, this is a famous comedian, he's famous in the UK, Robin Ince. There's a slight resemblance between us, as you can see. I've used this to great comic effect, because usually when we're appearing in the same venue, I've had his fans come up with their books, and I've autographed them, which really pisses them off when they discover I'm not Robin Ince. By the way, he's done the same stunt back to me. But anyway, we do this thing. Now, the point is that, we become face experts. In fact, you're born as incredible. Your ability to tell the difference between faces is remarkable. Babies can tell the difference between faces of humans and monkeys. For example, they can tell the difference between these rhesus monkeys. But we find it really difficult because as we get older and we're more exposed to the same faces, we become tuned in to the faces that we encounter the most. So if you don't see monkey faces, then they become indiscriminable. But babies, they can tell the difference between any face, but they lose that ability as they get older. So again, it's this general principle that you have this flexibility of mind that enables you to kind of become tuned into your environment. But it's not just the perceptual world or the perceptual environment you become tuned into. I'm increasingly coming to the idea that, in fact, our brain is a social brain. And what we're really specialized for doing is tuning into other people. And we have this, we know that there are areas which process, for example, the physical or the perceptual aspects. We've got these areas here. We've got areas of the brain which seem to be activated when you're thinking about what someone else is going to do next. We call that mentalizing. We have areas which are activated when you're feeling their emotions, when you're interacting with them emotionally. These are the deeper centers here. And then there's a whole mirroring system which has been found in the past 15 years, which appears to be triggered by watching someone else's actions. We automatically empathize with them. We automatically almost duplicate or resonate with them. So there are well-established circuitry in the brain which all facilitates social interaction. But I think this is something which our species does. We are a highly social species. I mean, you think about it, look at us all here. We congregate in crowds, and we do strange things. And here's a wonderful example of mirroring. For example, this is Michael Owen, who's just missed the goal, and look, he's put his hands up, and they're all doing it. except for, of course, this guy here, but he's obviously he's in the opposite team. And so we get great enjoyment. There's a lot of emotion from being in groups. And I think this is something that is wired into us. And we're wired into looking after the vulnerable in our, and raising our children. This is something which is just part of our nature. Now, we know that the importance of the social environment from looking at case studies where children have been raised in very abject social environments. Classically, this is the famous case of Victor, the wild boy of Aveyron, who's discovered in about 1800, who'd been living in the woods outside the small village in France. And he was believed to be around about 10 years of age. He had sort of been abandoned and had managed to survive by himself. And he became a cause célèbre because at the time, the philosophers like Rousseau were arguing, well, man's born inherently good. And so here was an opportunity to test this idea by looking at a child who'd been raised in the absence of the influence of society. So they wanted to know, was he inherently good? Well, the trouble with Victor was he was never rehabilitated. He was profoundly damaged and died very early on. But that was a very old case. That was 200 years ago. More recently, we've had the case of Jeannie. This is the 13-year-old who was discovered in the back room of her grandfather's apartment in LA. And she, again, never fully recovered. She was socially retarded. And then, of course, more recently, we've had the wild children like Oksana Malaya, I think she is. She's the Russian wolf girl. But the problem with all of these cases is that with feral children, as they're sometimes called, you don't really know what was the initial state of this child. Were they brain damaged initially, and was that the reason that they were abandoned? But we have had one opportunity recently, well, fairly recently, with the case of Ceausescu's regime. These are the Romanian orphanages. This is the footage of these children who were raised in terribly deprived environments. Basically without any social interaction, they were hosed down. And really, frankly, a very depressing state of affairs. Well, the normal social interaction, the nurturing environment, what I think is necessary. Now, these children, when the world discovered them, we descended upon them, and they were fostered out to US and to Canada and to Britain. And Mike Rutter in Britain studied up 111 of them, and then followed them up at 4 years and 11 years. These are now young adults. And the interesting thing was they were assessed on their kind of cognition, they were assessed on their kind of physical growth, and they were also assessed on their kind of social skills. And the interesting finding was that if the children had been adopted before the age of 6 months, if they're really, really young babies, then they were absolutely fine. But the longer they had been in the orphanages, the more depraved and the more abnormal their development was. And they were impaired socially, emotionally, and cognitively. And it wasn't anything to do, well, they factored out all the physical differences, but it was something about the duration of time that they had been in isolation. And we should have known this anyway from the work of Harry Harlow. I mean, Harlow had demonstrated that when you raise rhesus monkeys in isolation, they also end up being socially retarded. And they also have a critical period of about 6 months. So if you take them out of this really poor environment and give them an enriched environment, they're just fine. But the longer you leave them in isolation, the more the permanent damage. So it's not just the perceptual systems which are being dependent on the environment. I think the social systems are increasingly dependent on the environment as well. So we're born to be pro-social. And there's a lot of evidence suggesting that babies have this circuitry which requires them to interact with others. I work with babies and I work with young children. This is my thing. They empathize and they will emotionally resonate with other babies. They'll cry when they hear the sounds of crying. As they get a bit older, they have all the kind of aspects of their behavior which is really kind of geared up to trying to get emotions out of other people. And they'll help as well. So I'm going to show you a bit of imitation. For anyone who doubts that babies are paying attention to others and trying to engage them, I think this is a compelling piece of evidence. You're going to see a video of two babies, and the father standing in the background, he sneezes, and he sneezes again. But just watch how the babies respond to this.
It's my voice. Oh, bless you. How's your baby? Oh, bless you.
Okay, I rest my case. Okay, so the babies are born to emulate and copy, and you can see what they're doing. They're doing it to control the parent, because the babies are controlling us. The children are controlling our emotional systems. Just the way you're laughing, and that in itself is again evidence that we're just this integral, important social reaction we need. But babies will also help. They will try, and it's in their nature to try and help strangers. This is another little bit of video, which is a classic. This is Felix Warnekin's work. And this is an adult, and this is, I think it's an 18-month toddler. So the adult's trying to do a task.
Oh. Oh.
Okay. You can never go wrong with baby videos. It always works. Okay. So, who is this self that's emerging? Well, we're pro-social, and we're tuning into others around us, and we're trying to get a rise out of them emotionally. But we have to become individuals. We have to become self-sufficient. I don't think it's any coincidence that humans have the longest period of childhood in comparison to any other social animal. And it's not just because we're transferring information from one generation to next. It's because we need to become socialized. We need to become members of the tribe. And that is a drawn-out process. Initially, this experience is very much centered on the child as the center of attention of the parents. But as they start to interact with their siblings and their peer groups, and then into adolescence and teenage and so on and so forth, you see this changing focus of interest and a changing self. You start to see yourself in terms of what other people think about you. That's the general opinion. So they start off recognizing themselves. They start off with an emergence of an identity around about 3 years of age, and that identity becomes elaborated by the stereotyping, by the sort of things that we tell them, by the expectations of what boys do, what girls do, and so on and so forth. They also develop a theory of mind, which is our capacity to put themselves in other people's shoes, to understand other people's perspective. A 3-year-old finds it really hard to take someone else's perspective. By 4 years of age, they've got that pretty well. And they're starting to worry. They're worrying about how they're getting on. They're worrying about self-esteem. They're worrying about where they are in the pecking order. We are preoccupied with what other people think of us. And that is something which is at the, I think at the heart of a lot of anxiety as you're growing up as a child. So we start off this path, emulating, copying, trying to be like the tribe. I love this one. This is the Italian MEP, and she took her daughter to an important vote. I don't know if she got the extra vote for that, but you can see that this is something that we just do. Okay. Now, as you become a member of a tribe, you have to balance your needs, your expectations, your desires, your wants with other people. So you have to coordinate with them. You have to learn how to become sociable. You have to control your own urges, desires, and drives. And that's really one of the interesting things about very young children is they're incredibly impetuous. They find self-control actually very difficult. So to do that, they need to be able to suppress their urges. And we know that that's part of the circuitry which involves the later developing frontal areas of the brain, which control and regulate the drives of the lower centers. But here's a good example of this capacity for self-control. This is a famous test called the marshmallow test. And it demonstrates the difficulty which children have in controlling and regulating their own behavior. So in this task, they've been told they can have 1 marshmallow now, but if they wait, they can have 2 later on. So they have this marshmallow sitting in front of them, and you can see the difficulty, this consternation this causes. So to be a valuable member of society, you have to learn to control your urges and impulses. And those of us that give in to them all the time, you know, we become victims of our impulses, and we do things which are not always in our best interests. So to become socialized, we have to learn what are the rules of our tribe, how do I behave, and how do I control my behavior. So these are all part of the development of the self. Okay? Now, those who can do that, they end up to be very well integrated. If they can control and regulate their own behaviors, they are much more socially competent, they've got more friends, they do better at school, and they're more emotionally stable. And actually, their behavior at 4 years on this task, because the longer you can delay is a measure of how much self-control you have, it predicts how well they do as adults. So if you think about the brain, it's actually a multitude of systems. And you can see anatomically it is, but generally you can just talk about the early kind of low-level input systems, and then you've got the drives, you've got the kind of the emotional systems which motivate you to do things, and then you have all these higher order systems which are all the representations of knowledge and control and regulation. And these all have to work in unison, but they can break down. So, for example, in suppressing those urges, what you may not know is that every time you have to resist doing something which is very tempting, it can deplete your capacity for self-control at a later date. This is called ego depletion. So for example, if you have to avoid eating that delicious pastry, that actually is very difficult. So that when you're then presented with another really tempting task, you just give in. Or if you have to work on a very difficult puzzle, or you have to fire somebody, doing something which requires a lot of self-control reduces your capacity for subsequent behavior. So when we expend mental effort, we deplete our self-control. So job interviews, you know, if you come out of that job interview, you really need that stiff drink. Or if you're firing somebody, you really need to eat that pastry. Any of these things show that we're in constant conflict, drives which are trying to pull us in one direction or the other. So whilst you may know what's good for you, the external circumstances that you find yourself in can change your decision processes. Again, it's this idea that you are not necessarily the driver at the seat. There are all these external influences which are competing and trying to capture your behaviors. Does anyone know who Mary Bale is? I'm not sure if it's worth telling this story, but this is the lady who put the cat in the bin. Hands up if you know that story. Yeah, okay, I'll tell you about it. If you haven't, this is kind of wild. So this is a woman, I think it was a couple of years back, became an internet sensation because she did this bizarre thing. She was walking along the street one day, and this is the video from the security camera by the homeowners, and they posted this on the internet because they want to know what was going on. And she sort of strokes the cat, and she'd been doing this every day for the past 30 days or so. And then on this particular day, for no reason, apparent reason whatsoever, she just opens the bin, picks the cat up, and throws it in the bin, and then walks away. And the British public the British are renowned for loving their pets, okay? And she became the figure of hate. She was eventually identified. It turns out she was a bank worker called Mary Bale. And they compared her to the worst mass murderer possible. This is how bad dumping a cat in the wheelie bin was. And the reason this is the relevant case is because this was an act of impulsivity. Now, why does someone do something like that? Well, what you probably were not aware of, she was under incredible emotional stress. She was actually, that visit she was doing every day was to her terminally ill father. She was also in danger of losing her job. This might be an example of the lack, where suddenly a sudden impulse just takes control of your behavior, and for reasons which seem beyond your control, you kind of just do it. Now, that's a sporadic, random event. But here's another example where somebody loses control of their behavior. This is Charles Whitman, the Texas sniper. And again, a very interesting case. In 1967, he climbed the tower of Austin, Texas, and he shot dead something like 20 people or so. But the really interesting thing about this case was that he was aware that he was not in full control of his behavior, because he wrote a suicide note prior to the atrocity. And he said, look, there's something really wrong with me. After I'm dead, I'm going to leave you money because I want you to perform an autopsy. And they did perform an autopsy after he'd been shot down by the police. And it turns out he had a massive tumor on the amygdala in the area which controls and regulates rage. Now, does that mean that he was responsible? I mean, I think most of us would agree that a tumor is something which is unusual and could change someone fundamentally, and then, therefore, we wouldn't necessarily hold them responsible for their behavior. But where do you draw the line? what is the basic line for responsibility? Where does the self become responsible for the actions? At the moment, there's a whole interest in the genes. There's a gene called the warrior gene you may have heard about, but other genes which are now being used in criminal cases where people are arguing, well, they've got a biological disposition that they can't control their rage. And so I think there's a really interesting dilemma that we're facing as society. If we're going to suggest that there are factors which can almost abdicate your responsibility, well then, where is the self in this equation? So this self, subjectively, most of us feel that we're controlling our bodies, that we're inhabiting our bodies, that we're the authorship of actions, that we're really driving this like a kind of, this is a still from Men in Black, we're kind of inhabiting our bodies like an alien driving this body. And in fact, there's some studies on people who meditate and on people to try and locate their sense of self. If you ask people to try and get themselves into a deep state of relaxation and try and point to their head where they feel the center of their consciousness exists, this is the plot you get. People typically think they exist somewhere inside their head sitting behind their eyes. And that's a reliable phenomenon. But the trouble of having a little person sitting behind your eyes is that if there's someone sitting behind your eyes, then who's inside their head, and their head, and their head, and their head, and so on. So that's the logical problem of having the entity. That's the logical problem of having the homunculus, this kind of mini-me inside your brain. There can't be a mini-me because that just restates the problem. There must be, you know, multiple mini-me's, which I think is probably more accurate. This is a cartoon. I'm not suggesting there's lots of little homunculi inside your head, but from a neuroscience perspective, it's true to say that there are lots of separable processing systems which are working fairly autonomously, but come together. And this coming together is what the brain does when it creates this experience of a unified character. And we know this from the work of Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga. These are the split brain patients. These had intractable epilepsy. And one of the ways that you can treat that is to cut the connecting fibers between the two hemispheres, the corpus callosum. Now, effectively, you create someone with two brains which are operating to some extent independently. And he demonstrated, for example, if you get them to focus on a fixation point on a screen, due to the way that the information transfers to the opposite hemispheres, if you present the word key on the left side, that's processed in the right side of the brain. If you present the word ring on the right side, that's processed in the left side. Now, language tends to be located on the left side. So if you ask them, well, what do you see? Then they say ring. But if you then say, well, pick up the object, then with their left hand, because that's controlled by the right side of the brain, they pick up the word, they pick up the key, because that's what's gone to the right side of the brain. So that's interesting, because you can have almost two separable streams of consciousness. But what people do then is that they're then asked to explain why they've done this. They will confabulate a story which makes sense of it. In other words, the brain is not the commander-in-chief, as Steve Pinker would say. It's the kind of spin doctor of experience. It's trying to make sense of all this separable incoming information to weave a coherent story. And I think we're doing that all the time. So this is the self story. We have this idea, or this characterization of who we are, and we justify it all the time. There's a vast body of work on cognitive dissonance, and this is this ideal notion of who we are, that when we do something that doesn't fit with our characterization of who we are, if we think we're kind of generous and we're mean to somebody, we'll just rewrite the story to make sense of it, to fit with who we are. If we think that we're kind of passive and then show aggression, we'll say, well, the person really deserved it. So we reformulate stories all the time to fit with the characterization of who we are, and this is the cognitive dissonance. Here's a study in Sweden, Freddy Swedes that we have in the house, by Johansson. And this is an interesting experimental study. The person was asked to choose which of two faces was the one that they thought was more attractive. And they would point to. And then by a degree of kind of sleight of hand, what the experimenter would do on some of the trials would give them the person they've just rejected, the opposite one. And what the interesting finding was that on a substantial number of trials, the person would then go on to give a perfectly lucid explanation of why they thought this was the better looking person. So in other words, they were justifying their decisions after they'd already made them. Now, this idea that we're dependent on others, we're justifying things I think, is very prominent in the field of social psychology. There are many examples where this notion of autonomy is actually being superseded or usurped by others around us. This is the classic work of Solomon Asch, showing that if you have 11 people saying that black is white, then there's a good tendency other people will agree, you'll agree with them. Because we don't really want to be seen to be different. The power of the group is surprisingly strong. Then there's a famous work of Milgram, I'm sure you're aware of, the fact that if somebody, an authority figure, tells you to electrocute somebody, then actually, surprisingly, 3 out of 4 people will do it. They'll go all the way up to the full range. Whereas when they were asked to make a prediction, psychiatrists thought only maybe 1 in 100, i.e. psychopaths would do this. But it turns out we're all capable of actually complying if the circumstances are right. And then, of course, Zimbardo has sort of shown this to some extent. And also Henri Tajfel in my department in Bristol showed that if you just arbitrarily separate people into groups, they will start to behave very pro-socially to the in-group and very aggressively or anti-socially to the out-group. So as soon as you form these tribes, then you get these mechanisms kicking in. And of course, there are real-world consequences. People will do things as soon as they see someone as out-tribe or an out-group member, that gives them license to do real inhumane things to other people. As soon as they become no longer part of our tribe, it justifies that kind of treatment. Okay, so the last bit, I'm nearly there. I just want to say, well, this is all very well, but what's happening with this tribe? Well, we're becoming interconnected, aren't we? We're becoming, our technologies are changing. We're communicating in ways that we've never done before in the evolutionary history of our species. We kind of evolved on the savannas of Africa, but now we can connect and communicate and interact with individuals instantaneously across the globe. So what will this do to the self? Well, take Twitter, for example. We think that we're all kind of individuals, but actually, if you do the analysis of Twitter communication, it's very easy to see that actually people are starting to formulate around concepts and ideas. So although we feel we're individuals, we do behave in a herd mentality all the time. But here's one I really like. This is the case from Second Life. This is one of these virtual worlds that you can inhabit. And this is a case from 2 years ago in England, David Pollard and Amy Taylor. And they were members of this virtual community, Second Life. And David, this was his avatar. He kind of liked Italian suits. His avatar owned a nightclub, very suave, sophisticated. And Amy Taylor, she was more for the kind of country and western look. She liked Diamante and denim. And she went by the name of Laura Skye. Well, Dave Barmy and Laura Skye met on Second World and communicated, exchanged emails, and then decided to actually meet up in real life. And as you can see, there's a bit of a disconnection between their avatars. This is their idealized notion of who they are, and this is their physical manifestation of who they are. Now, the interesting aspect about this is that they actually ended up moving moving in with each other and living together, and they got married, and everything was going fine until Laura came, or Amy, I should call her. You see, even I'm getting confused. Amy came home one day to find that David was at the computer in the midst of an embrace with another avatar. And so she filed for divorce and won. And that's a bizarre notion if you think that's art imitating life. And it's a strange idea. Finally, I think that even if you have a problem with the self, or the way that I'm trying to formulate it, I think that we still kind of do have this implicit idea that maybe we're not being true to ourselves. I think we're kind of aware of the power of others around us. And this is a book that came out last year, and I thought this was very telling. This was the wishes or the 5 regrets of people who are on their deathbeds. This is a book by Bronnie Ware, who's a palliative nurse, and she basically said to people who were about to die, what are your regrets in life? And the top regret was that people felt they'd never been true to their self. They felt there was a character that they thought that they were, but the circumstances never allowed them to live out their lives as such. So, I hope you don't think this is a depressing idea to eradicate the self. Rather, I think it's a kind of liberating idea. I think it's kind of take on board the power of others, that we're formed, just like the Knizia illusion is formed by the context of the squares. I think the context of others around us is what forms us. And if you take them away, either through disease or, if you remove all that context, then, maybe you can disappear as well. So I think others are really important. So I might be a kind of meat machine or machine of some form, but I'm still human. And good night.
Thank you very much, Bruce. We have time for a few questions, so I'd like to ask the audience if, and I would like to ask the audience to help me with the microphones because it's hard to reach everybody. I see one question back there. Anybody? Okay, let's try this. Maybe I don't know. Okay, I'll start with here and I'll move back.